Hello and welcome. You are listening to an informed take on current events brought to you by law students and staff of Queen's University Belfast. This is Lawpod.
Welcome to Lawpod. My name is Reece Simpson. I'm an undergraduate law student at Queen's University, and today's Lawpod session focuses on stop and search powers in Northern Ireland. I'm very grateful to say that I'm joined by Dr. John Topping, who I'm now going to hand over to introduce himself.
Hi, and thank you for having me on Lawpod. My name is John Topping. I'm a lecturer in criminology in the School of Social Sciences, Education and Social Work, and I'm also a fellow at the Senator George J. Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security and Justice. Outside the day job, and I suppose partially related to some of this, I'm also chairperson of Community Restorative Justice Ireland, and I sit on the Executive Committee of the Northern Ireland Association for the Care and Resettlement of Offenders, and also the rights-based organisation on the Executive Committee on the Committee on the Administration of Justice
Ireland. So I thought it would be a good opportunity to start this conversation by looking at a quote from Professor Geraldine Van Buren, Commissioner at Equality and Human Rights Commission, who stated that in seeking to protect the rights of the majority, the police at times have to infringe certain rights of individuals, such as the right to privacy or freedom of movement. And her conclusion was that such infringements were acceptable provided three criteria were met. That is, that the infringement was rational, proportionate and lawful. And so in looking at stop and search powers in Northern Ireland, in broad terms, what is the rationale for granting police stop and search powers, and how can this counterbalance the rights of the individual?
I suppose the quote there from the Commissioner, that's very sort of classic Rawlsian perspective, you know, this utilitarian idea that some small minority of people must give up their rights for the majority. I suppose before we get to stop and search specifically in Northern Ireland, I think this idea of dealing with marginal populations is something we can have a look at. And actually, when you look at that in relation to stop and search, this is by no means a new power. In fact, has an extraordinarily long pedigree. If we go back as far back as the Great Plague of the 14th century, that wiped out about 150 million people across Europe. And at the time, what happened, we started to see the shift in state power for people essentially in the aftermath of the Great Plague who were classified as vagrants and valiant beggars. Their freedoms were essentially curtailed and they were pushed into the services of the middle and the upper class, really about concerns related to economic efficiency at the time, or people today we might call socio-economically marginal. If we then skip forward a little bit in this idea of controlling certain people by the state, actually through Henry VIII, he passed the Punishment of Sturdy Vagabonds and Beggars Act of 1536. And again, this idea people who are detached from normal social structures should somehow be reined in and controlled. And then, of course, if we skip forward a little bit into the 18th century, we've had, of course, Henry Fielding, the Westminster magistrate. He wrote his inquiry into the cause of the late increase in robberies. That was in 1751. And again, very common themes that we get nowadays about relations between poverty, crime, moral breakdown. And then, of course, moving into more modern times, and I suppose the modern era of policing, 1829, of course, we had Robert Peel. And again, he was about this idea of regular patrolling and that, again, the very language of modern stop and search, that the patrolling police constable would deter thieves and apprehend any individual about whom he had reasonable suspicion. And that, I think, is the key term in modern times, reasonable suspicion. This idea that the police organisation have some sort of reasonable suspicion that somebody has committed or is about to commit or is in possession of some sort of prohibited items or weapon, or I suppose in terms of modern concerns, drugs. But I think that point of proportional use, that point of justified use, that has never particularly, if at all, been the case with regard to stop and search. Even going back to the Vagrancy Act of 1824. That was essentially the basis, a law formed in the 19th century. That was the basis of the Brixton riots, the very infamous sus laws, the stop under suspicion laws, was certainly seminal in really destroying relationships and heightening tension between the Metropolitan Police at the time and, of course, sort of the black community at the time, Afro-Caribbean community at the time in London. And really this idea that disproportionality, targeting particularly of minorities from socioeconomic backgrounds, as I don't think ever, it's ever been anything but. And if we move forward into very modern times, even debates in the last 30 years in England and Wales, this idea of disproportional targeting of people from black minority ethnic communities has absolutely persisted, on both normal stop and search type powers, but also in relation to terrorist powers as well, which we've seen more recently.
It's clear, evidently, then the rationale behind such powers goes back in history a lot further than at least I certainly would with it. In terms of the key legal tests or pieces of legislation, what is it that makes this legal or justifies stop and search powers in Northern Ireland?
Okay, so I think we're going to concentrate here on what we might term normal or everyday stop and search powers, because of course the terrorist-related stop and search powers are a very different it's a very different legal regime. But I suppose concentrating on these powers, I suppose seminally we had in 1984 we had the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, which came into being in England and Wales. And then 5 years later, we had the Police and Criminal Evidence Northern Ireland Order of 1989. And essentially that lays down the test of reasonable suspicion. And essentially reasonable suspicion is sometimes misunderstood. Reasonable suspicion is in fact a legal test which must be satisfied every single time when this power to stop and search is invoked. That has to be based on intelligence. It has to be based on particular circumstances. There has to be a reason. It can't be done on stereotyping. It can't be done on prejudice. It can't be done on preconceived ideas about particular sections of society. Can't even be done in terms of people who have a prior criminal record or even known to the police. So it has to be objective information. And I suppose the best way to test that, as they do more recently, or have done more recently in England and Wales, is whether the object of the stop and search actually matches the outcome. So if I have reasonable suspicion that you're carrying a knife, if I find that knife, then those two issues match up. If I don't, then perhaps is this issue of reasonable suspicion, is it, was it based on sound grounds? And I think where we have seen some issues in and around that, particularly in 2013 for England and Wales, at least, what was then Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary, found that almost 30% of all stop and searches did not meet the legal threshold to engage stop and search. And, when you look at that in terms of Northern Ireland, we don't have those particular sets of information to be able to delve into that for the Police Service of Northern Ireland, for PSNI. But the other way we can look at that is through the very blunt, I suppose, measure of arrest rates. If reasonable suspicion, by giving it a large margin of appreciation, was accurate, you would expect there to be quite a high number of people arrested when a stop and search is actually engaged. In England and Wales at present, only 17% of all stop and searches actually result in an arrest. So again, does the object meet the outcome? Do they match up? But for Northern Ireland specifically, and for 2017-18, only 7% of all stop and searches actually result in an arrest. Or in other terms, 93 out of every 100 stop and searches does not result in any further action. So again, that would raise issues related to reasonable suspicion. How is that formed organisationally? What's the culture around that? What about in the minds of the officers? How is that formed? Are there particular different cultural values within different sections of PSNI? I'm not too sure, and I certainly can't answer that because the evidence doesn't exist. But this idea of reasonable suspicion, it's quite a flexible, it's quite a fluid test. But I think it goes back to the idea, as you talked about at the start, the usual suspects, I think, is a term well used. What we do know from the wider evidence, that the majority of stop and search falls on stereotypically socioeconomically deprived young males, and also particularly people from black minority ethnic communities. So overall, how stop and search is being used in terms of reasonable suspicion has always been subject to question, and I think it does raise issues for the approach that police take, both here and in England and Wales.
Is there any other ways then that we could approach stop and search, and who is stopped and search in Northern Ireland?
Yeah, well, I think one of the ways, arrest rates are a very blunt measure of looking at how successful they are, because, of course, when you look down the line, arrest rates don't actually encompass the crime figures on down in terms of clearance and clear-up rates. So they're probably actually an inflation of how successful stop and search really is. I suppose that the other way to look at this is we don't, of course, have the capacity, nor do we fall around individual officers as criminologists every hour of every shift of every day to be able to understand the decision-making processes. That is, based on their training, it's based on their experience, and it's almost impossible to legally question. But again, when you start to piece together the wider patterns of stop and search usage, I think that is the aggregate way in which we can begin to see how well it's being used and also who it's being targeted against. And I think what I can draw your attention to are the findings from the most recent Young Life and Time survey. That's through ARC and the Northern Ireland Life and Time survey. And that chimes very closely with wider research which has existed in Scotland and in England and Wales for close to 3 decades. There we have long understood that stop and search is, as I've said, used against socioeconomically deprived young males in the main, and also in England and Wales specifically the race issue. In Northern Ireland, that evidence has actually been markedly lacking for the last 20 years, almost for the entirety of the lifespan of PSNI. But the Young Life and Time survey has, for the first time ever in PSNI's history, given us a window into who exactly is being targeted. And just to give you a bit of context around who and how and the extent of stop and search targeting, I suppose it's useful to delve into some comparison, because I talked earlier on about PACE, the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, and the equivalent Northern Ireland Order of 1989. That is almost identical, almost precisely identical to England and Wales. Also, we have, the mirror legislation of the Misuse of Drugs Act of 1971. And those are two almost identical pieces of legislation. So that allows us to look at some comparison in terms of volume of use and in terms of effectiveness. And what we actually have seen in the last 5 years, particularly in England and Wales, and also Scotland, which you'll talk about, since really the time when Theresa May was Home Secretary, there was a renewed focus on this idea of the effectiveness of stop and search. And really from them, we have seen very steep declines in the last 5 years of the use of stop and search in England and Wales. And that's reduced from, I think, a peak of about 1.2 million back in 2000, 2010, 11, 12, and that's dropped down for 2016 to about 303,000 for England and Wales. So that means at present they're stopping and searching the population at a rate of 5 per thousand of population. What we've actually seen in Northern Ireland over the last 10 years, from 2004-5 through to 15-16, for example, the use of everyday stop and search, these Misuse of Drugs Act and these Police and Criminal Evidence Northern Ireland Order powers, they have actually increased by 74%. Okay, so any police power, of course, which increases by such an amount, you imagine there may be more attention and scrutiny on that. But suffice to say, that has been the picture. So very much we have been an outlier, and particularly in Scotland as well over the last 5 years. The groundbreaking research of Kath Murray, she did there and identified very high levels of stop and search use, again, particularly against children and young people. Of course, Scotland has a different legal regime. So when you bring that back in terms of the how much question, we're actually doing stop and search in Northern Ireland at a significantly higher rate than England and Wales. As I said, England and Wales at present stop and search for these ordinary powers at 5 per thousand of population. For PSNI, PSNI, that actually runs at about 13 per thousand specifically for these normal powers. And that's, again, more than Police Scotland, which is 9 per thousand. And again, the other difference we can see is a 17% arrest rate for England and Wales. And for this year, a 7% arrest rate. That was 6 last year, so it has, of course, climbed slightly. So we're doing it more than the rest of the UK with less success. And that brings me back to the Young Life and Times survey, because in a very similar and familiar way to England and Wales and Scotland, we have for the first time through this research understood that it is a young working class male issue here. The findings very clearly state and show us that if you are a young male living in a socioeconomically deprived area, urban area, you're 2.5 times more likely to be stopped and searched for no other reason than living in a socioeconomically urban deprived area. So I think that shows this idea of potential partiality to policing. The fact that, that you go back to that classic policing works best where it's needed least. Most policing does tend to be concentrated. It's not an issue here by any means. Most policing does tend to be concentrated in socioeconomically deprived areas. And we know that where there are more police, there are going to be more stops and searches. So that particularly is an issue. And specifically looking at children as well, this has been long raised as an issue by various NGOs and charitable organisations. For example, the Northern Ireland Commissioner for Children and Young People, through Include Youth, through the Institute for Conflict Research. There's been about a decade of research which shows us that children are particularly bearing the brunt of PSNI stop and search, and particularly in terms of relationships with PSNI, that is having a net negative effect. And what we know from 2010-11 through to 2017-18, that approximately the power of stop and search has been used approximately 33,000 times against children. So that's very significant. And when you look at that, when you look at the actual, what we might say, the further action rates, and again, PSNI figures around this are not particularly clear, but when an item is found against, when a young person stopped and searched, only in about 5% of cases is any further action taken against that child, the under 18. So stop and search is being used significantly. It has been used significantly, and yet it has very little outcome. So when you put that together with the fact it is being concentrated, and of course stop and search by its legal basis is not an evenly spread power, it has to have a justification every time, it does add up to and leads to questions about why the power, first of all, is being used so significantly against children. It also raises a question as to why, after a decade of general research showing this to be an issue, why nobody seems to be paying attention to it. And also the third key point in and around that is what are, not just the issue of the effectiveness of stop and search, but what about the effects? What are the effects on these young people in these areas who are systematically stopped and searched with so little success and outcome rate, the damaging relations? We know from all the social science, criminological research out there that stop and search does have a damaging net negative effect on police-community relations, so particularly for children and young people. And of course, Northern Ireland being Northern Ireland, we can't, of course, forget recent history. So this idea of young people fusing this very real, practical experience, a negative experience of stop and search, as we have in lots of other places across the UK, with more recent histories, with cultures, with attitudinal issues to PSNI, you can start to see how that can create a bigger a bigger barrier, if you like, and a more complex barrier to police-community relations and this idea of policing with the community by PSNI. So it's a complex picture, but ultimately I think it's a picture which has not commanded as much attention as it probably should have over the past decade.
Well, based on those statistical trends you've identified and how Northern Ireland differs from the rest of the UK, how would you assess, I know you've hinted at it there, the implications of stop and search powers for a community or even for the police service in itself in relation to Northern Ireland and its history?
Yeah, I mean, a very interesting, very complex question. Of course, we have that baseline of the recent history of Northern Ireland. PSNI is essentially, almost 18 years young, an 18 years young organisation. Very much the story of policing in Northern Ireland has been based around two key issues, in my opinion. One is, of course, the police reform process. A lot of the political, social, policing capital has all been about getting policing right. Policing was always this idea, it was the last piece of the political jigsaw, and if policing could be gotten right, the other pieces of the jigsaw would fall into place. And that was very much the case for PSNI. So a lot of it has been about policing has been about the reform narrative, and this idea of normalised policing, community policing, very much at the core of the pattern reform process. The other side of the coin, if you like, has been in relation to the very, it's great that the terrorist threat is diminishing, as we have seen over the last number of years. It has been reducing quite significantly. But again, a lot of that narrative has been about moving away from the security situation, the terrorist situation, and again, moving towards normal policing. Somewhere in the middle, this idea of normal practice, I think, probably hasn't seen or been given the attention that it should, precisely because normal policing, if you like, and I'm thinking about stop and search as a form of normal practice, is really transmuted into this idea of, it's normal, so therefore it must be good. Let's not particularly pay any attention to that. And I think we can see that quite remarkably in the last decade of Northern Ireland Policing Board annual policing plans. Not once has stop and search been mentioned. Not once has the term stop and search come up in a decade of Policing Board policing plans. So I think that says a lot about how much discretion, if you like, has been afforded to PSNI to use this power. And when you look at it dispassionately, there's a great bit of research for people listening by Kath Murray and Dermot Harkin in British Journal of Criminology. And they were looking at Police Scotland, and they have this very nice analogy of hot and cold political climates. And essentially, a hot political climate puts a lot of pressure around policing. There's a lot of attention, there's a lot of focus, and people will put pressure, downward pressure, to perhaps adjust and change practice, as we've seen very much in Police Scotland, where they have reduced stop and search very significantly. Again, I suppose a corollary of that is a cold policy, cold political climate, where there isn't much political attention, there isn't much interest, there isn't much social, even press interest. And I think that's been the picture of really the picture and the climate around stop and search in Northern Ireland. Nobody has particularly been paying attention to this everyday power. And I use that term everyday deliberately because, of course, we actually know a lot more about terrorist-related stop and search powers in Northern Ireland for a very, necessary reason that we have had to use, and we have the persistent terrorist threat. And just to give you a bit of a context to that, in England and Wales, about 99.7% of all stops and searches are done under this normal everyday Misuse of Drugs Act and PACE legislation. In Northern Ireland, only about 70% of stop and search is done under this normal legislation, with about almost a third done under terrorist legislation. That would be the Terrorism Act of 2000 and also the Northern Ireland Only Justice and Security Northern Ireland Act of 2007. We have a wealth of research, particularly coming from the independent overseer of the JSA Justice and Security Act, and also during the conflict, suppose the pre and post conflict periods of Northern Ireland, there has been a wealth of research dedicated to the use of powers, these special powers, special measures, many of which are actually still, of course, used today in England and Wales, or have taken on a new form. So I think, again, that has helped to shift the focus away from the everyday stop and search powers. And it's within that space, if you like, they have been allowed to flourish in this cold policy climate. So that there's that wider issue of accountability, of oversight. Why has this not been seen as an issue? But also internally as well. And I know when certainly the age-related statistics started to take hold in January of 2017, the Detail TV was working through them. They ran a story on children and young people and stop and search. Why for so long has this been seen as normal, this sort of practice in within PSNI internally? What have the checks and balances been? I know PSNI said they do have internal checks and balances in terms of how much this power is being used. But again, do some of those contentions, however notional, really help us to and help PSNI to provide some sort of proportionality, justification, checks and balances? Because when you look at the PSNI statistics around stop and search, and particularly across the districts, there is very little to no correlation between the levels of stop and search, the levels of crime, and also the arrest rates across those districts. Certainly looking at the stop and search figures for 2016-17 across PSNI districts, in 3 of PSNI districts the arrest rate was as low as 3%. In some districts it climbed up to 10%, and also we've seen very significant variations in the levels of stop and search compared to the amount of crime. So again, that would suggest that culturally, perhaps within PSNI, that different areas, different sections, perhaps different management structures have different or pay different sorts of attention to the use of stop and search. And I suppose it's that analogy, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Within the organisation, well, this power is working, it's a way in which we can deal with certain sorts of crime and certain sorts of people. And if nobody else is questioning it, why on earth would PSNI? That's certainly a picture we've seen in England and Wales for the last 30 years, and people have had to knock on those doors to make the police aware that this power is problematic.
Well, in a cold policy climate such as you described as Northern Ireland, do you think the public is adequately aware of their rights when it comes to stop and search?
A good question. Are people really aware of their rights? And again, it's this idea of which people, because of course stop and search doesn't generally, and again this is on the evidence that we know from the Young Life and Time survey, and again of course this is specifically around children, but what we do know is that stop and search is proportionately done far, far less in what we might describe as middle class, well-off areas. So that section of society doesn't generally experience stop and search. So almost it doesn't need to know, those sorts of people don't need to know their rights because it really doesn't happen to them. So when you shift to socioeconomically deprived urban areas where it's happening 2.5 times more, are those young people aware of their rights? I'm not entirely sure. One of the issues which is becoming clear, and certainly as we saw in that research from the Young Life and Time survey, young people are aware that they can't be stopped without reason, some sort of reasonable cause. I mean, they were very clear on that in the research. But at the same time, about 50 to 60% of them actually thought that just merely looking suspicious was a reasonable cause. So young people self-identifying as suspicious by virtue of being out in public space. And then again, at that point of interaction, there is no systematic training or awareness out there which tells young people what could or should happen. For example, we have in England and Wales, there's a great organisation, again for people listening, you can look at them up on the website, called Stopwatch. They're a charitable NGO type organisation who provide some monitoring around the use of stop and search in England and Wales. A subsidiary programme they have is called Why Stop, and essentially that Why Stop programme is about raising awareness. It's about providing training for mainly young people who are subject to stop and search. What should you do? What are your rights? Does this officer has the power? What should happen to you? And again, one of the big significant issues we saw coming out of the Young Life and Time survey is that young people, when the stop and search is actually happening, clearly they weren't aware of the boundaries of what PSNI should be doing. In terms of process, on young people's awareness, what we found was that 69% of people in the survey had been given no clear reason for being stopped and searched. So again, invoking the question of reasonable suspicion. Is reasonable suspicion actually being used? We also found that, and very significantly, in 88% of direct stop and search experiences, officers fail to provide identifying details. Officers absolutely have to provide identifying. That should be 100%. And in 90% of cases, young people, 16-year-olds, part of the survey, said that officers did not record details on an electronic device and no receipt or record was provided to them. That is very significant, because what that points to is the fact that stop and search is happening much more than is being recorded. And when it's not being recorded, PSNI cannot be held accountable. And when there's no accountability mechanism, then young people have nothing to work from. There's already a low level of awareness of the police ombudsman in Northern Ireland in terms of their role and what they can do. So almost this power is being used in certain areas with impunity. And when you take that a little bit further, we can look to stop and search and this idea of repeat stop and search, because of course, if it's happening in a known area, there are a known group of young people. And again, the Life and Times survey showed that a significant number of people, young people, thought stop and search is being used as a form of harassment, and it was actually unnecessary. Legally, if an officer is going to stop and search a young person, okay, whether or not they have grounds, that's a subsidiary point. So, and if that young person perhaps is regularly stopped and searched, or reasonably regularly, if that officer comes up to the young person and says, I'm going to do a stop and search, and the young person says, yeah, get on with it, that then technically becomes a consensual stop and search. Therefore, the legal grounds for invoking PACE, of the Misuse of Drugs Act, aren't there, and they don't need to be there. So therefore, it's a stop and search which happens without any grounds, and therefore it doesn't need to be recorded. So this all points to the fact that stop and search is in fact happening much more than is actually or officially being recorded by PSNI. And there's also the issue as well of the informal stop and search practice of stop an account, okay? And the only form and the only legal basis for stop an account in Northern Ireland is actually under the Justice and Security Act, Northern Ireland Act of 2007, the terrorist-related legislation. There is no legal power for an officer to come up and ask anybody for you to stop you an account for your whereabouts, account for what you're doing. And I suppose that taking the logic of that further, legally they can't then find a reason to stop and search you just by virtue of you not cooperating with them, when in fact there's no legal obligation for you to cooperate with them. So there's a complicating array of issues in there about this idea of this asymmetrical power between the police, and particularly between, getting back to your original question, between people who aren't aware of their rights. They don't know what they should do. They don't know what they should expect. And I think that extends in the modern era as well to social media and recording. Very clearly, PSNI have said in their internal, in their internal, publicly available internal memos, that there is no general blanket restriction at all on anybody recording or video recording a stop and search encounter. But what we see, and again, this is anecdotal, and it is available on YouTube. There are numerous accounts where officers are asking people, young people, it doesn't matter what age, to lower their cameras, to stop recording for security reasons. There's no legal basis for that, and I think this sort of takes us into the era of social media and openness and transparency and accountability. Because I think when you look at it dispassionately, if an officer thought you were video recording them for some sort of terrorist purposes, I imagine they do much more than ask you just to lower your camera. So again, this idea about how this power is seen, how it's used, how it's understood. I think in Northern Ireland we are quite a way behind England and Wales, primarily because this previously, up until now, simply has not been seen as an issue.
Well, even considering the social media context that you've just mentioned, and in more recent growing awareness of personal data, whether it was with Facebook or even, dare I say it, the dreaded word of GDPR that everyone seems to be talking about, the lack of release of such evidence into numbers and accurate numbers of stop and search by the PSNI do people have a right to that information?
Yeah, well, there's two different things going on there. First of all, are the public records of stop and search. I mean, anybody can go onto PSNI's website and get stop and search figures, either by terrorist-related stop and search, the numbers carried out. That, again, is broken down by district, by age. So there's a reasonable amount of information out there, and if the public want to have a look at it. You do need, in some regards, to know what you're looking for when you're on PSNI's website, because it is a complex area. What does it mean? How does it compare to previous years? So that's the public outward-facing regime. Then also, if you are stopped and searched on a personal, individual level, under ordinary, everyday legislation, you are entitled to a receipt or a record of that. Usually what happens and what should happen is that PSNI officers will enter that into their electronic device and then give you a reference number, and then you're able to go and subsequently get a record of that stop and search encounter. But of course, some of the issues of monitoring leave a lot to be desired in Northern Ireland. Of course, we have issues of, the orange and green issues never gone away. It never will probably go away in the near future. We don't currently, PSNI currently don't collect that sort of Section 75 data. They don't record whether somebody is Catholic or Protestant when they are doing stop and search. So that raises an issue of equality and who, where people are being stopped and searched, and that's in no shape or form suggesting PSNI are using the power disproportionately, but I think it's an issue which we need to grapple with. Very logically, if PSNI are going to be running some operation in a particular area of North Belfast, which itself is highly segregated, and they are in Area X, which is a predominantly Protestant area or predominantly Catholic area, of course there are going to be more instances of stop and search there because of the segregated nature, nothing to do with PSNI's operations necessarily. So I think that's a conversation which has yet to be had. I know it's something PSNI have looked into with regard to terrorist-related stop and search. They ran a pilot down in Derry with regard to recording religion. That didn't at all work or yield any useful results. So the idea of recording, I think, is something that we need to look at, and we're well behind. There are very, very sophisticated recording systems now in Police Scotland in terms of recording all sorts of detail, particularly around young people, around wider details, around repeat offences, flagging up young people who are persistently coming under purview of the police. So I think, the monitoring, the quality of the information is something which needs to be looked at. Again, in an ideal world, this is something the Northern Ireland Policing Board would be on top of. Of course, they are hobbled at the minute by the lack of political progress at Stormont, but hopefully once they get up and running again, the issue of stop and search and what we're actually measuring will start to rise up the agenda.
And if a member of the public feels they have a legitimate grievance, are there any mechanisms available to them to seek legal redress?
Well, I suppose the main port of call would be through the Police Ombudsman, the Office of the Police Ombudsman for Northern Ireland. Interestingly, when we look to the Police Ombudsman figures, the amount of complaints around stop and search are low to negligible. So people, whether or not outside the existing research that we know from young people specifically that they are seeing stop and search as a problem, those people are not going to the Ombudsman. That's not to say that there aren't problems with stop and search, but of course there's a very low awareness within sort of the young people demographic, particularly children, around who the Police Ombudsman were, awareness of their role, what they do, what they should do. But again, accountability. If taking the evidence from the Life and Time survey at face value, if records are not being given, I think there is that power dynamic. Who, what is the basis of that complaint if there is no evidential trail there? And it certainly puts young people, particularly, in a relatively powerless position. And again, going back to your original point at the start around this idea of proportionality, now this sort of idea, this sort of Rawlsian utility perspective, do those rights for a lot of young people even exist at all, when there's no way of actually, upholding these rights? Are these rights for some sections of society notional rather than actually real or tangible? And I think, that's bound up in the wider policing system here in Northern Ireland. And until we have more sophisticated, more robust recording of stop and search, I don't think we're going to get to the bottom of that issue anytime soon.
And would you consider the problems of a systematic nature within the police, such as maybe a code of practice, in terms of those areas you've discussed?
Yeah, well, what we have in Northern Ireland is very similar to England and Wales. There's Code of Practice A for Northern Ireland. That is issued by the Department of Justice here. The most recent iteration of that was May of 2015. And that essentially sets out the framework, the guidelines for how stop and search should be used. Actually, in comparison to England and Wales, we're slightly ahead with our Code of Practice, because within Code of Practice A, it is inscribed the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and it does very specifically say that stop and search should be used essentially sparingly. It should only be used in the best interests of the child, and that if the powers are being used disproportionately, then the use of that power should be drawn into question. So again, are we at the stage where that power should be drawn into question? I would say, I think reasonably we are. And not just Code of Practice A, we also have PSNI's own Code of Ethics, which very clearly states that if any police powers are being used disproportionately, that must be justified. Can PSNI justify using this power more than anywhere else in the UK with less effect? It certainly isn't fighting crime. We know generally that stop and search does not fight crime. PSNI's website does say it's there to prevent and detect crime. The legal basis of ordinary stop and search is not preventative. It's technically an investigative tool. So it doesn't deal with entire crime categories. We know from research from the College of Policing, for example, that PSNI doesn't deal with whole categories of crime, have any statistically significant effect, in terms of violent crime, in terms of burglary, and of course some categories it has no effect, no relation, such as online crime and domestic abuse as well. I think the popular arguments come when you look at knife crime and drugs, and I suppose the most recent example I can give you is in regard to, the upsurge in violent crime and knife crime in England and Wales over the last couple of years. They actually brought in a campaign, it was called Operation Blunt by the Metropolitan Police, and I think that extended out to some other constabularies as well. And what they actually found was that increase of stop and search in those target areas in some cases had statistically no or a negligible effect on reducing knife crime, and in fact knife crime reduced in some areas where Operation Blunt wasn't even in effect. So that's the example there. So there's a very big divide between evidence-based policy about whether stop and search works and policy-based evidence that it's a great political soundbite. Stop and search is a symbolic, visible, tangible form of policing being seen to be done on the streets to the usual suspects, and I think there's some reassurance role to that. And even if you pull that down to, and I think we can bring this in specifically to Northern Ireland, drugs are a perennial issue, not just here, all countries throughout Europe. And when you drill into PSNI's normal type crime, normal type stop and search, what we know is that of the ordinary stop and searches under PACE, under MDA, Misuse of Drugs Act, actually almost 75%, 3/4 of all everyday stop and searches are done under the Misuse of Drugs Act, 1971. So you take that fact, you take that with the targeting of urban, socioeconomically deprived young males, and what we're seeing here in terms of the use of stop and search in Northern Ireland is a pattern in the main of stopping and searching young males for low-level drug possession. Now, is that an effective use of resources? Because I think the other way to look at this is if you're repeatedly doing this in particular areas, okay, and you're repeatedly, as PSNI statistics show us, not yielding very high or at all high arrest rates, then that starts to create a damaging effect. It reduces information flows, actively works against community type policing and engagement. And it creates what we call a ratchet effect, where relationships become soured, there's a distance, they become more confrontational by their nature, and then the only real way PSNI have to engage with those young people are through these sorts of powers. So I think, that is particularly an issue about why low-level drug possession is a focus of, such a focus of stop and search, and why ultimately it yields such low results.
Well, I suppose in conclusion, or in a brief summary, would you have any indication of possible solutions or ways forward in which the police service in Northern Ireland could deal with the potential loopholes or negatives that you've identified?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question. I know certainly since January of last year, when PSNI released for the first time age-related figures into the public, and then I had run a conference last year as well involving PSNI and the Policing Board and Ombudsman and Criminal Justice Inspectorate, there seems to be more attention devoted to stop and search. I think in terms of fixing it, I don't think there is any fix to stop and search. I think stop and search by its nature will always remain as this flexible power which will ultimately reflect the police power dynamics with certain sorts of people and certain sorts of communities. I think certainly what we do need, and there's no short-term fix of this, is a policing board to get back up and running. We then also need much more attention focused on stop and search to begin to unpick some of these issues more fully, because in many regards, as I said before, we have much more detail and knowledge about terrorist-related stop and searches, so we need to shift some of that focus. Also internally, PSNI need to begin to examine what is allowing or facilitating or enabling stop and search to be used to the extent that it is, really reflecting not just whether, the how much question, but also for themselves as an organisation which pride themselves on policing with the community as the core of their service. Is what they're doing in terms of stop and search damaging their ability to do policing with the community? Because again, it's that balance of effect versus effectiveness. If the effect of what your organisation is doing is outweighing, its ethos of policing of the community, if the effect of stop and search is having a net negative effect, as we know it does from all the evidence, then should it not be reduced? Should we begin to use it less? Because what we have seen in England and Wales, while stop and search is reduced dramatically, we have not seen any significant increases in crime. In fact, when you look at Northern Ireland, we actually have some of the lowest, I think the lowest levels of crime on record last year, 98,000, the lowest since PSNI came into existence. There are much lower levels of being a victim of crime in Northern Ireland compared to England and Wales. Fear of crime is at about a 20-year low according to the Northern Ireland Crime Survey. So do then we really need to use stop and search? And for me, the other question related to that is perhaps stop and search a symptom of the diminishing resources of PSNI in terms of their ability to respond and be in the community, because we know there have been some soundings recently that, and there have been perennial soundings and research that policing the community policing is not necessarily working or effective in some areas. So if you tag that on to the idea of diminishing resources, PSNI officers on an individual personal level have less time and are expected to do more. Is stop and search then a symptom of that? Because is it a quick fix for dealing with certain sorts of people and certain sorts of crime? I can't answer that on behalf of PSNI. And I think, upping some of the focus around the recording, looking, for example, to Police Scotland and their very sophisticated recording systems to stop and search, and also perhaps having some sort of independent advisory group as well, I don't think would go amiss, to have not just, general views around policing and young people, but actually a specific advisory group on stop and search to really get to the heart of what's happening, where it's happening, because we've got the evidence from the Life and Times survey, which is challenging for PSNI. So why not use that evidence and turn that into organisational action, which can help actually PSNI do their job better, because nobody wants to be in a position where certain sections of society are in a confrontational environment with PSNI because of certain sorts of policing practice. And I think, as we've seen in England and Wales, just as a final point, stop and search is not an absolute necessity, crime-fighting necessity. It's an organisational practice which can be changed when the rules are tightened and loosened. And perhaps in Northern Ireland we need to look to a little bit more rule tightening in order to reduce some of the wider problems that are starting to spill out and bubble out from the evidence that we know.
Well, thanks very much. That's definitely a thought-provoking and very informative Lawpod session today. One final quick question. If any of our viewers wanted to independently look at the research which you've acquired, maybe you could give a heads up at where they could go to find that.
Yep, there are a few different sources for anybody interested in following on, students or general public or anybody. In fact, you can go on to the ARC website. If you go onto Google, very simply put ARC and Young Life and Time survey, you'll find the latest survey results up there. And also for a more general overview, you can also go on to the Northern Ireland Assembly website and look up their KES Knowledge Exchange seminar series, where they'll also find a range of information, slides and policy briefs I've written on stop and search also.
Well, thanks again for coming onto the show and giving up your time. We will put that information in the show notes as well for any of our listeners.
And thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
You've been listening to Lawpod, an informed take on current events brought to you by law students and staff at Queen's University Belfast. This episode was produced by Reece Simpson, Michael Sheerin, Richard Somerville and Rachel Killeen. Our theme music is by Colonel Chocolate and the Justice Triangle. Lawpod is funded by Queen's Law School and the Queen's Annual Fund. Thanks to Dr. John Topping for today's episode. You can follow us on social media. We are on Twitter at QUB Lawpod. For more information, you can visit our website, lawpod.org, and please have a look in the show notes for more information about the topics covered today. You can find us on iTunes or anywhere else you can get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. I'm Reece Simpson and this was Lawpod.